The conference room fell silent as my boss finished presenting my 8-month project to the board of directors. Every graph, every metric, every innovation stolen. He didn't even change the font on the slides I'd created at 3.0 inches the morning. The CEO was nodding, impressed. The board members were leaning forward in their chairs, and Nigel Harrington, my boss, was basking in applause that belonged to me. I caught his eye for just a second. He had the audacity to smirk. That's when I made my decision. I smiled back, gathered my notebook, and walked out of that room with my head held high. Within the hour, I'd cleared my desk, packed my personal items into a single box, and did something I'd never done in my 7 years at the company. I turned off my work phone. By Monday morning, that phone showed 8-9 missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize, and 6 from the CEO himself. Welcome to the Payback Office channel, where karma has an office address and justice works overtime. If you're here because you believe in standing up for yourself in the workplace, you're in the right place. Hit that subscribe button and help us reach 8,000 subscribers, because every subscription tells me there's someone else out there who refuses to be walked over. My name is Beatrice Langley, and until last Friday afternoon, I was the Senior Innovation Architect at Innovatic Dynamics, one of the fastest-growing technology firms in London. The title sounds fancy, but I never forgot where I came from. A middle-class neighborhood where my parents taught me that respect is earned through integrity, not titles. That upbringing taught me empathy, taught me to value people over profit. It's also what made what happened next so inevitable. Let me take you back to where this really began. About a year and a half ago, Innovatic Dynamics had been hemorrhaging clients to a competitor called Apex Systems. Their platform was faster, more intuitive, and frankly better than ours. Our quarterly earnings calls had become progressively more uncomfortable with investors asking pointed questions that our executives couldn't adequately answer. I'd been with the company for 7 years at that point, working my way up from a junior developer to my current role. I'd always been the person who stayed late, who volunteered for the impossible projects, who mentored newer employees even when I was drowning in my own deadlines. I loved what I did and I was good at it. During one particularly brutal Monday morning meeting, our CTO, Malcolm Fairchild, laid out the problem in stark terms. "We're losing market share at an unsustainable rate," he said, pulling up a graph that looked like a red ski slope. "Unless we can offer something revolutionary, something that leaps ahead of Apex entirely, we're looking at major redundancies by next fiscal year." The room had gone quiet, 30 people, some of the brightest minds in the industry, and no one had an answer. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the problem from every angle. Our platform wasn't bad. It was just incremental. We'd been making small improvements for years, but what we needed was a complete paradigm shift. Around 2 inches the morning, it hit me. What if instead of trying to compete with Apex on their terms, we created something entirely different? What if we built an adaptive intelligence layer that learned from user behavior in real time and essentially customized itself for each individual client? Not just personalization, true adaptive architecture that evolved. I spent the entire next day sketching out the framework. The more I developed the concept, the more excited I became. This wasn't just innovative. This could redefine our entire industry, but I knew I couldn't do it alone. The project would require resources, time, and most importantly, buy-in from leadership. So, I did what any ambitious employee would do. I requested a meeting with my direct supervisor, Nigel Harrington. Nigel had been my boss for about 2 years at that point. He'd been brought in from outside the company, someone with an impressive CV from a competitor that had since gone under. He was charismatic in meetings, always knew the right things to say to executives, and had a way of making people feel like they were part of something important. Looking back, I should have seen the red flags. Nigel rarely had original ideas of his own. Instead, he was exceptional at what I called idea laundering, taking suggestions from his team, repackaging them slightly, and presenting them as collaborative efforts where he somehow always ended up with the lion's share of credit. But I was naive. I thought this project was too big, too important, too clearly mine for him to co-opt. I walked into his office that Thursday afternoon with a 30-page proposal complete with technical specifications, projected timelines, resource requirements, and financial projections. He'd barely looked up from his computer when I arrived. "Beatrice, good, come in. Make it quick though. I've got a lunch at the club at 3. I'd presented the entire concept in 15 minutes, watching his expression change from polite disinterest to genuine attention. By the time I finished, he was leaning forward, actually reading the documentation. He paused, flipping through the pages. "This is actually brilliant. This could save the company." Relief washed over me. "I'm glad you think so. I'd need a dedicated team, probably 4 or 5 people full-time for at least a year." The budget breakdown is on page 22. Nigel had nodded slowly, still scanning the document. "Let me take this to Malcolm and the executive team. This needs top-level approval." "Of course. When should I prepare for that presentation?" He looked up then, something shifting in his expression. "Oh, you don't need to worry about that. I'll handle the executive presentation. You focus on refining the technical specifications. If they approve it, you'll need to hit the ground running." A small alarm bell had rung in my mind, but I dismissed it. He was my boss. Of course, he'd present it to the executives. That was how the chain of command worked. "Okay," I'd said, "just let me know if you need any clarification on any of the technical aspects." "Will do. Great work, Beatrice. Really great work." I'd left his office feeling validated, energized, ready to change everything. 3 days later, Nigel called me into his office again. "Good news," he'd said with a broad smile. "The executive team loved it, Malcolm especially. We're green-lit for the full project. Congratulations." I'd felt like I was floating. "That's incredible. When do we start?" "Immediately. I need you to put together your team by the end of the week. You'll report progress to me weekly, and I'll keep the executives updated." And that's exactly what happened for the next 18 months. I handpicked my team carefully. I needed people who were not only technically brilliant but also creative thinkers who wouldn't be afraid to challenge assumptions. I brought in Derek Patterson, a data architect who'd been underutilized in the infrastructure division. His ability to design scalable systems was exactly what we needed for the adaptive intelligence layer. Then there was Allison Reyes, a UX designer who understood that beautiful interfaces meant nothing if they didn't serve the user's actual needs. Her insights into user psychology proved invaluable. For the machine learning components, I recruited Jackson Cole, a young data scientist who'd published papers on adaptive algorithms while still doing his postgraduate studies. He brought fresh perspectives that our industry desperately needed. Finally, I added Simone Laurent, a project coordinator who'd kept some of our most chaotic initiatives on track. Her organizational skills meant I could focus on the technical vision while trusting that deadlines and deliverables wouldn't fall through the cracks. Together, we became something special. We weren't just colleagues. We were a unit working towards something bigger than ourselves. The first 6 months were brutal. We were essentially building something that didn't exist, which meant there was no roadmap, no best practices to follow. Every single day presented new problems that required innovative solutions. There were nights when I slept on the office couch, not because anyone demanded it, but because I'd be in the middle of solving something and couldn't bear to lose momentum. My team matched my energy, not because I required it, but because they believed in what we were creating. True to his word, Nigel held weekly check-ins with me. I'd present our progress, explain the challenges we'd overcome, and outline our next milestones. He'd nod along, ask a few surface-level questions, and occasionally offer generic encouragement. "Keep up the good work," he'd say. "The executives are very interested in this." What I didn't know, what I had no way of knowing, was what was happening in the meetings I wasn't invited to. Every week, Nigel would take my updates, my team's breakthroughs, and our innovations, and present them to Malcolm and the executive team as his own strategic vision. He'd apparently developed a narrative where he was the mastermind, and I was simply the talented technician executing his brilliant plan. I was completely unaware. I was too buried in the work to pay attention to office politics. My entire world had narrowed to the project, to the problem we were solving, to the solution we were building. Around month 9, we hit our first major breakthrough. Jackson had cracked the adaptive algorithm framework in a way that exceeded even my initial vision. The system wasn't just learning, it was anticipating. It could predict user needs before users themselves knew what they needed. I'd been so excited that I'd called an impromptu team meeting at 9:00 on a Friday night. "Do you understand what this means?" I'd said, barely able to contain my excitement, as Jackson demonstrated the prototype. "This doesn't just put us ahead of Apex. This makes everything else in the market obsolete. This is industry-defining." Allison had actually got emotional. "We did it. We actually did it. We're not done yet." I'd reminded them, though I was grinning. "But yes, we did it. The hard part is over. Now we just need to refine, test, and scale." Simone had pulled out her timeline. "If we maintain current pace, we can have a beta ready for limited deployment in 7 months, full rollout 2 months after that." I'd immediately scheduled a meeting with Nigel for first thing Monday morning. This breakthrough deserved immediate executive attention. When Monday came, I'd walked into his office with my laptop, ready to demonstrate what Jackson had achieved. Nigel had been on his phone when I arrived, wrapping up what sounded like a personal call. He gestured for me to sit, finished his conversation, then turned his attention to me. "Beatrice, good morning. What's so urgent?" I'd launched into the explanation, pulling up Jackson's demonstration, walking through the implications. I'd expected excitement, maybe even amazement. Instead, Nigel had simply nodded, his expression neutral. "Good progress. Keep me posted on the testing phase." I'd been taken aback by his underwhelming response. "Nigel, I don't think you understand. This is the breakthrough. This is what makes the entire project viable. I understand, Beatrice," he'd interrupted, his tone slightly sharp, "and it's excellent work. But we need to manage expectations. It's still not deployed, still not generating revenue. Let's not count our chickens before they hatch." I'd left his office confused and slightly deflated, but I'd pushed it aside, telling myself he was just being cautious, managing risk the way executives had to. The next 9 months were a whirlwind of testing, refinement, and iteration. We'd encounter a problem, solve it, encounter another, solve that. With each challenge we overcame, the platform became more robust, more elegant, more revolutionary. My team was running on fumes and pure belief. We'd become so close that we could practically read each other's minds. Derek would start a sentence and Allison would finish it. Jackson and Simone had developed their own shorthand communication that sounded like another language. And through it all, I kept Nigel updated. Weekly meetings, detailed reports, constant communication. What I also didn't know was that during this time, Nigel had been systematically positioning himself as the project's creator throughout the company. In executive meetings, in stakeholder updates, in casual conversations, he'd woven a story where the adaptive intelligence platform, as we'd officially named it, was his brainchild. Some of my team members had heard rumors, had tried to tell me that Nigel was taking credit, but I dismissed their concerns. "The work speaks for itself," I'd said. "When this launches, everyone will know what we built. The credit will go where it belongs." I was wrong. Month 17 brought us to the beta deployment phase. We'd selected 5 mid-sized clients to test the platform in real-world conditions. The results were beyond anything I'd projected. Client satisfaction scores increased by 47% within the first month. Efficiency metrics improved by 32%. And most importantly, 3 of the 5 clients increased their contract values voluntarily because they saw such tremendous value in what the platform provided. The internal buzz was extraordinary. Word spread through Innovatech Dynamics that something special was happening. People I'd never met were stopping me in hallways to ask about the project. Malcolm, the CTO, had even sent me a personal email, hearing great things about the AIP beta, looking forward to the full presentation. That email should have been my first real clue that something was wrong. Looking forward to the presentation? I'd assumed I would be giving it. I'd built it. My team had sacrificed everything for it. Of course, I'd be presenting it. But I didn't ask questions. I just kept working. Month 18 was focused on preparing for full rollout and creating the comprehensive presentation for the board of directors. This wasn't just an internal update. This was the presentation that would determine the platform's future, the company's strategy, and potentially the trajectory of our entire industry. I'd spent 3 weeks crafting every slide, every data point, every visual. I'd practiced the presentation so many times I could recite it in my sleep. I'd anticipated every possible question and prepared detailed answers. The night before the board presentation, I'd finally gone home at a reasonable hour. I'd laid out my best suit, prepared my notes one final time, and actually got a full night's sleep. I wanted to be sharp, energized, ready to show the board what we'd accomplished. I'd arrived at the office at 6:30 that Friday morning, 90 minutes before the 9 presentation. I wanted time to set up, to do one final run-through, to center myself. At 7:15, Nigel had appeared at my cubicle. Beatrice. Slight change of plans for this morning. I'd looked up from my laptop where I'd been doing a final review of the technical specifications. What kind of change? I'll be delivering the board presentation. The words hadn't immediately registered. I'd actually laughed, assuming it was some kind of joke. Good one. Seriously though, I want to get into the boardroom early to test the display setup. His expression hadn't changed. I'm not joking. I'll be presenting to the board. Your role will be to attend as technical support in case there are detailed questions. The floor had seemed to drop out from beneath me. Nigel, I built this. My team built this. I created every slide in that presentation and you did excellent work, he'd said, his tone maddeningly calm. But board presentations are strategic, high-level. They require a certain finesse. You're a brilliant technician, Beatrice. But this requires executive presence. I'd stood up, my hands actually trembling with the effort of maintaining my composure. Executive presence. I've been with this company for 7 years. I've presented to stakeholders and clients too. The decision is made, Nigel had interrupted, his voice now carrying an edge of authority. This comes from Malcolm. The executive team feels it's appropriate for the department head to present major initiatives. Then let me present with you co-present. I know every technical detail, every Beatrice. His tone had shifted to something almost pitying. You need to understand how these things work. You did the technical work and it's appreciated. But the strategic vision, the business case, the executive positioning, that's leadership work. That's my work. Your contribution will be acknowledged. Acknowledged. The word had felt like a slap. I'd opened my mouth to argue further, but something in his expression had stopped me. This wasn't a discussion. This wasn't even really an explanation. This was him informing me of a reality that had already been decided. I expect you in the boardroom at 8:45, he'd said. Wear something professional. And Beatrice, don't make this awkward. This is a big day for the department. He'd walked away before I could respond. I'd stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, my mind racing through options. I could go over his head to Malcolm, but Nigel had claimed this came from Malcolm. I could refuse to attend, but what would that accomplish besides making me look petty? I could interrupt the presentation, claim credit in front of the board, and destroy my professional reputation in the process. Every option led nowhere. At 8:45, I'd walked into that boardroom wearing my best suit, carrying my notebook, my face a perfect mask of professional neutrality. The board members had filed in at 9 sharp, 12 people who would determine the future of the project I'd poured my entire life into for 18 months. Malcolm had opened the meeting with some preliminary remarks, then turned the floor over to Nigel. Nigel has been leading an initiative that we believe will fundamentally transform our competitive position. Malcolm had said, I'll let him walk you through what his team has accomplished. His team, not my team, his. And then Nigel had begun presenting, using my slides, using my data, using my words, my frameworks, my vision, everything I'd created at 3, 0 inches the morning and during weekends and through countless nights when I'd chosen this project over sleep, over relationships, over everything else in my life. He'd presented it flawlessly. I had to admit he'd clearly memorized the entire presentation. He'd anticipated questions. He'd spoken with confidence and authority about technical details he barely understood. And he'd never once mentioned my name. He talked about our approach and the strategy we developed. And when we designed this framework, every "we" was carefully vague, implying his leadership without explicitly lying, but never once acknowledging that I had been the architect of every single element he was describing. 45 minutes into the presentation, one of the board members, a woman named Margaret Chen, who had a reputation for cutting through nonsense, had asked a pointed technical question about the adaptive algorithms learning framework. Nigel had hesitated for just a fraction of a second, then turned to me. "Beatrice, you want to field that one? You handled the technical implementation." All eyes had turned to me. I'd felt the weight of that moment. I could answer the question simply and let this charade continue. Or I could tell the truth, could explain that I hadn't just handled the implementation. I'd created the entire concept, designed every framework, led every breakthrough. I'd caught Nigel's eye. That same smirk from earlier had been there, barely visible, daring me to make a scene, confident that I wouldn't. And in that moment, something had crystallized for me. I'd spent 7 years being the good soldier, the team player, the person who put her head down and did excellent work and trusted that excellence would be recognized and rewarded. I'd been the one who stayed late, and volunteered and mentored and sacrificed. And here was my reward. Watching someone else wear my accomplishments like a borrowed suit while I sat in the corner, acknowledged only when a question was too technical for him to fake his way through. I'd smiled, closed my notebook, and given the most concise technical answer possible. Nothing more than what was asked. No elaboration, no passion, just pure information. The adaptive learning framework utilizes a nested neural network architecture with real-time feedback loops. Specific technical documentation is available if you need deeper detail. Margaret had nodded, satisfied, and Nigel had smoothly continued with the presentation. The remaining 30 minutes had been torture. Every slide felt like a theft. Every nod of approval from the board members felt like something being stolen from me in real time. When Nigel had finally concluded, the board had actually applauded. Malcolm had stood up, shaken Nigel's hand, and said words I'll never forget. "This is exceptional work, Nigel. This is exactly the kind of strategic thinking and leadership we need. I think we're looking at the next Director of Innovation here." Director of Innovation. A position that didn't currently exist. A position being created in that moment as a reward for stealing my work. Nigel had accepted the congratulations with perfect false modesty. "Thank you, Malcolm. Of course, this was a team effort. I'm fortunate to work with talented people like Beatrice. Like I was one interchangeable part of a large machine. Like my 18 months of vision and leadership and sacrifice were equivalent to anyone else's contribution." The meeting had adjourned. Board members had filed out. Nigel had been surrounded by executives offering congratulations. No one had approached me. I'd sat there for a moment after the room cleared, my hands folded on top of my closed notebook. And that's when I'd made my decision. I'd stood up, walked calmly back to my desk, and begun the most satisfying 30 minutes of my professional life. First, I'd open my laptop and access the shared project drive. With a few keystrokes, I'd change the access permissions, locking everyone except my 4 team members out of 18 months of proprietary code, documentation, and technical specifications. Not deleted. I wasn't going to destroy my own work, just locked. Then I'd open my email and send a single message to Derek, Allison, Jackson, and Simone. Emergency team meeting. Coffee shop across the street. Right now, don't discuss with anyone. I'd cleared my desk methodically, personal items in a box, my extra pair of shoes, the coffee mug my niece had made me, the small succulent plant that had somehow survived on my desk for 3 years despite my neglect, family photos, everything that was mine. I'd packed. Then I'd reached into my bag and pulled out my work phone. The phone that had ruled my life for 7 years. The phone I'd answered at midnight and on weekends and during holidays. The phone that had meant I was never ever truly off duty. I'd held it for a moment, feeling its weight. Then I'd powered it down completely and placed it in the center of my now empty desk. I'd picked up my box, walked to the lift, and left the building. My team had been waiting at the coffee shop, their faces confused and concerned. "What's going on?" Derek had asked immediately. "Are we being shut down?" I'd set down my box and looked at the 4 people who trusted me, who'd sacrificed alongside me, who deserved to know the truth. "Nigel just presented our project to the board," I'd said quietly. 18 months of our work. He took credit for everything. Not some of it, not partial credit, everything. The silence that followed had been absolute. "What?" Allison had finally whispered. He told them it was his strategic vision, his leadership, his framework. I was mentioned once as someone who handled technical implementation. Jackson's face had gone red. "That's he. Can't we can do something right? We can tell someone we can. We can't do anything that won't destroy our own careers." I'd said going public would make us look petty, vindictive. He's a department head about to be director. We're individual contributors. The company will protect him, not us. "So, we just let him get away with it?" Simone had asked, her voice shaking with anger. I'd smiled then. Really smiled for the first time all day. I didn't say that. I'd explained what I'd done with the access permissions. Understanding had dawned on their faces. "The entire platform is locked," Derek had said slowly. "All the code, all the documentation, all the deployment specifications, everything they need to actually implement what Nigel just promised the board," I'd confirmed. "But you have access," Allison had said. "And you gave us access." "I did. What are you planning?" Jackson had asked. "I'm planning to not answer my work phone this weekend," I'd said. "What you all do is entirely up to you. But I want you to understand something. If you walk away from this, Innovatech Dynamics will eventually break the encryption and access the files. It'll take time, and it'll cause delays, but they'll do it. You won't be permanently sabotaging anything. You'll just be making a statement about how you expect to be treated." I'd looked at each of them individually, but if you stay, if you keep working on this project, Nigel will continue to take credit. You'll continue to be invisible, and that director position they're creating for him, that'll be built entirely on your backs while you remain exactly where you are. Simone had been the first to stand up. "I'm out. I'm done." Derek had nodded. "Same. I'm not working myself to death so someone else can get promoted." Allison and Jackson had exchanged a look, then both stood. "Where do we go from here?" Allison had asked. And that's when I told them about the email I'd received 3 months earlier. An email I dismissed at the time because I'd been completely absorbed in the project. It had been from a headhunter representing Horizon Quantum, one of the fastest-growing tech companies in London. They'd been interested in discussing a director of innovation position with me. I'd politely declined, saying I was committed to my current project. "I'm going to return that email," I'd said. "And I'm going to suggest that they might be interested in talking to a complete team that's just built something revolutionary. A team that works exceptionally well together. A team that's currently available." I'd seen the understanding click into place on their faces. "You're saying we all jump together," Derek had said. "I'm saying I'm jumping, and if you want to jump with me, I'd love to have my team back, but that's entirely your choice." They'd chosen to jump. We'd spent the rest of Friday afternoon at that coffee shop drafting a joint email to the Horizon Quantum recruiter. We'd outlined what we'd built in general terms without violating any NDAs or proprietary information agreements. We'd explained that we were a complete proven team looking for an opportunity to be valued appropriately. By Friday evening, we'd all received responses requesting interviews for the following week. I'd gone home that night feeling lighter than I had in months. I'd ordered takeaway, opened a bottle of wine I'd been saving for the project's successful launch, and toasted myself in my quiet flat. Then I'd done something I hadn't done in 18 months. I'd taken a real weekend. I'd slept in. I'd gone to a farmer's market. I'd called my sister and had an actual conversation that wasn't distracted or rushed. I'd read a book that had nothing to do with adaptive algorithms or machine learning, and I'd left my work phone turned off. I hadn't even looked at it. Monday morning, I'd woken up naturally, without an alarm at 8:30. I'd made coffee, opened my laptop, and checked my personal email to confirm the interview schedule with Horizon Quantum. That's when curiosity had gotten the better of me. I'd reached for my work phone, still powered off since Friday afternoon, and turned it on. It had taken nearly 3 minutes to boot up and start processing the accumulated messages. The notification sounds had been almost comical, buzz after buzz after buzz, like a swarm of digital bees. When it had finally settled, I'd looked at the screen. 89 missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize. 6 missed calls from a number saved as Malcolm Fairchild, CTO. 12 missed calls from Nigel's direct line. 147 text messages, 63 emails marked urgent. I'd sat there with my coffee, scrolling through the carnage, watching the desperation escalate in real time. The first messages from Friday afternoon had been professional. Beatrice, we need to discuss the project handoff. Please call when convenient. By Friday evening, the tone had shifted. Beatrice, need you to call as soon as possible. Issues with the deployment timeline. Saturday morning had brought barely concealed panic. Beatrice, we're having access issues with the project files. Please respond immediately. By Saturday afternoon, the professional veneer had completely crumbled. Where are you? Call me now. Sunday's messages had been a mix of threats and pleading. Your failure to respond is a violation of your employment contract. Call immediately, followed an hour later by, let's discuss this reasonably. I'm sure we can work something out. The emails had told an even better story. Nigel had clearly spent his entire weekend trying to access the locked files, getting increasingly desperate as he'd realized that everything he just promised the board was completely inaccessible. He tried to bring in IT, but they'd explained that my encryption and access controls were technically sophisticated enough that breaking them would take significant time and might risk corrupting the data. He'd apparently then tried to recreate the work from his presentation materials, only to discover that slides and demos weren't the same as actual functional code. By Sunday evening, he'd escalated to Malcolm, claiming that I'd sabotaged the project and stolen company property. Malcolm's messages had been more measured, but no less urgent. Beatrice, I understand there may have been some miscommunication regarding Friday's presentation. Let's discuss this professionally. Please call me at your earliest convenience. I'd poured myself another cup of coffee and composed a single email response. Not to Nigel, not even to Malcolm, to HR with Malcolm CC'd. I'm writing to formally submit my resignation from Innovatech Dynamics effective immediately. My decision is final and not open to negotiation. I will be happy to discuss the return of company property, but I will need any such discussions to include HR representation and to be documented in writing. I will not be responding to phone calls or informal communication attempts. Please coordinate any necessary exit procedures through official channels. I'd attached a formal resignation letter signed and dated. Then I'd sent a separate email, this time only to Malcolm with Nigel CC'd. Regarding the Adaptive Intelligence Platform project files, I implemented security protocols that restrict access to protect proprietary work product. I'm happy to provide access credentials as part of a formal knowledge transfer process contingent on 1 appropriate recognition and documentation of project contributions from all team members. 2. Full exit compensation, including unused holiday time and any applicable severance. 3. Neutral reference letters for myself and any departing team members. 4. All discussions to be documented and conducted through official HR channels. I'm available for a single meeting this week to discuss these terms. Further access to my expertise beyond this will require a consulting contract at standard industry rates of £300 per hour. I'd hit send and closed my laptop. My personal phone had rung within 10 minutes. Malcolm's personal mobile number. I'd let it go to voicemail. He'd called 3 more times that morning, each time voicemail. Finally, around noon, my email had pinged. Malcolm again. Beatrice, I'd like to meet this afternoon to discuss the situation. Would 3:00 work? My office, I'd responded with a single line. I'm available for a meeting at 3:00, provided HR is present, and the meeting is formally documented. Please confirm HR attendance. His response had come back within minutes. Confirmed. Jennifer Wallace from HR will attend. I'd arrived at Innovatech Dynamics at exactly 3:00, wearing jeans and a casual jumper, not the professional armor I'd worn for 7 years. I was no longer an employee trying to impress anyone. I was someone who held all the cards, and I dressed like it. Jennifer from HR had been waiting in Malcolm's office when I'd arrived. She looked uncomfortable, her laptop open, clearly prepared to document everything. Malcolm had stood when I'd entered, extending his hand. I'd shaken it briefly and taken a seat. Beatrice, thank you for coming in, he'd started, his tone carefully diplomatic. I think there's been some significant miscommunication about Friday's presentation. Has there? I'd kept my voice neutral. Nigel has explained that you may have felt that your contributions weren't adequately acknowledged. That wasn't the intention. The presentation was meant to be a high-level strategic overview for the board, not a detailed attribution of individual contributions. I'd smiled politely. I appreciate you clarifying the intention. My resignation stands. Malcolm had leaned forward. Beatrice, you're a valued member of this organization. 7 years of excellent work. Let's not make a rash decision over a misunderstanding. It's not rash. I've given it considerable thought. Jennifer had been typing rapidly, documenting every word. What would it take? Malcolm had asked carefully, to resolve this situation. A promotion, a raise, public acknowledgement of your work on the AIP. None of those things, I'd said. As I stated in my email, I'm willing to facilitate a knowledge transfer regarding the project files. My terms are clear and non-negotiable. £300 an hour for consulting seems excessive. I'd pulled out my phone and opened a browser. That's actually below market rate for my level of expertise. I'm happy to show you comparable industry rates if that would be helpful. Malcolm's jaw had tightened. Beatrice, let's be frank. The company has legal recourse here. The work you did was done as an employee. It's company property. Locking us out of those files could be considered theft. I'd expected this. The work was done as an employee, which is why I'm not taking it with me or offering it to competitors. The files remain on company servers. I've simply implemented security protocols, which were actually recommended in our own IT security guidelines. I'm offering to transfer access as part of a professional exit process. If the company prefers to pursue legal action instead, that's certainly their prerogative. Though I imagine the discovery process would be interesting. What's that supposed to mean? It means that a legal case would require documenting who created what when. Email trails, document version histories, witness testimony. I have 18 months of documentation showing my creation and leadership of every aspect of the AIP. I'm confident that evidence would demonstrate that I implemented appropriate security on work I created. The silence that followed had been satisfying. You're willing to blow up your career over this? Malcolm had finally asked. I'm not blowing up my career. I'm starting a new one where my contributions are valued. Several of my team members are doing the same. His expression had shifted. Several team members, Derek, Allison, Jackson, and Simone, have all submitted their resignations this morning. You should be receiving them shortly if you haven't already. I'd watched the realization hit him. The entire team that built the AIP was walking away. The platform that Nigel had just promised the board was about to become impossible to deploy, maintain, or develop further. Malcolm had looked at Jennifer, then back at me. What do you want, Beatrice? I want what I already stated. Documented attribution, fair exit compensation, neutral references, and a single knowledge transfer meeting. After that, you'll never hear from me again unless you want to hire me as a consultant. And if we agree to these terms, you'll provide full access to all project files. I'll provide comprehensive access credentials and documentation. I'll even participate in a structured handoff to whoever you assign to take over the project, assuming they're technically qualified. Malcolm had rubbed his face, looking suddenly exhausted. Fine, Jennifer. Draft something that covers her requirements. Beatrice, I'll need you to be available later this week for the knowledge transfer. I'm available Thursday afternoon, 2 hours maximum. After that, consulting rates apply. Understood. I'd stood to leave, then paused. One more thing. I want it documented that Nigel Harrington presented my work as his own strategic vision without attribution. Not as an accusation, just as a factual record. That seems unnecessary. Malcolm had started. It seems necessary to me. Otherwise, my neutral reference will include a detailed explanation of why I left. Your choice. Malcolm had looked like he wanted to argue, but Jennifer had cleared her throat. It's reasonable, she'd said quietly, and it protects the company if there are future questions. Fine, Malcolm had said tersely. Anything else? That's all. I'll expect the exit documentation by Wednesday. I'd walked out of that office feeling 10 feet tall. The exit documentation had arrived Tuesday afternoon. Everything I'd asked for in writing, signed by both Malcolm and the head of HR. They'd even included a severance package I hadn't requested. 2 months of salary, clearly an attempt to prevent any future legal action. Thursday's knowledge transfer had been almost anticlimactic. They'd assigned a senior developer named Lucas to take over the project. He was competent, experienced, and clearly overwhelmed by what he was inheriting. I'd spent 2 hours walking him through the architecture, the access credentials, the documentation structure. I'd been professional and thorough. I'd even wished him luck. You built something remarkable, he'd said at the end. I don't know if I can maintain it, let alone develop it further. You'll figure it out, I told him. Or they'll hire a team to help. Either way, it's not my problem anymore. As I'd left Innovatech Dynamics for the final time, I'd walked past Nigel's office. He'd been at his desk, and for a brief moment, our eyes had met. He'd looked away first. The following Monday, I'd started at Horizon Quantum as their new director of innovation, with Derek, Allison, Jackson, and Simone joining as my senior team. The position came with a 30% raise, equity options, and something I hadn't had in years, genuine excitement about my work. 3 months later, I'd heard through former colleagues that the AIP deployment at Innovatech Dynamics had been delayed indefinitely. Lucas had done his best, but without the institutional knowledge and cohesive team that had built it, the platform had proven too complex to implement effectively. 2 of their beta clients had actually canceled their contracts due to the delays. 6 months after I'd left, Nigel had quietly departed Innovatech Dynamics. The director position had never materialized. Rumor was that he'd gone to a smaller firm, a significant step down from where he'd been. A year after my departure, Malcolm himself had reached out with an extraordinary offer. Would I consider returning as director of innovation with full autonomy and a substantial compensation package? I declined politely. I was too busy building something new. Something that was genuinely mine with a team that trusted each other and leadership that valued our contributions. Sometimes I think about that moment in the boardroom watching Nigel present my work as his own. How powerless I'd felt. How trapped. But I'd learned something crucial that day. They could take credit for my work, but they couldn't actually do the work. They could wear my accomplishments like a borrowed suit, but when it came time to actually perform, they had nothing. The real power wasn't in the title or the recognition. It was in the ability to create something valuable, and that was something no one could steal, no matter how hard they tried. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening to my story. If you've ever had your work stolen, your contributions dismissed, or your value overlooked, I want you to know this. Your worth isn't determined by who takes credit. It's determined by what you can create, and that always belongs to you. If this resonated with you, consider subscribing to the Payback Office channel. Help us reach 8,000 subscribers because every single one represents someone who believes in standing up for themselves. And remember, the best revenge isn't anger. It's building something so valuable that they can't function without you. Then taking it somewhere you're actually appreciated.